Don't even know where I am now. Okay, so what am I talking about? Psychedelics and creativity, which kind of almost doesn't really need any kind of introduction. Myself, I'm a psychologist, like most of the speakers, but unlike all the other speakers, I'm not at Goldsmiths. I'm at Greenwich, just down the road, where we have for many years hosted Europe's biggest psychedelic research conference. It's called Breaking Convention. Isn't at Greenwich anymore. I don't think my superiors could handle it for another 10 years, so it's now moved to the University of Exeter. But it is in and of itself it's quite an extraordinary kind of gathering if you want to deep dive into anything psychedelic. And my own area of research is on what I call the psychology of exceptional human experience, all the stuff you probably don't find on the back of a toilet door, or indeed on your average psychology degree. It's all the kind of weird and wonderful stuff at the other end of the spectrum, which doesn't normally get communicated, and that includes things like spiritual experiences and psychedelic experiences, and even paranormal experiences. And a lot of that intersects with creativity through altered states. So I'm going to primarily focus on psychedelics. And my interest in this area of research goes back 5,500 years. Well, it feels like that long, but I've only been doing it for a couple of decades. But and it started a couple of weeks ago, in fact, in Ireland, when I went to this place, amazing place called New Grange. I don't know if you've ever been there. It's 5,500-year-old, beautiful kind of ancient burial tomb with some really extraordinary artwork, which isn't like the oldest artwork in the world, but it is pretty impressive. The very first human art, what we call Upper Paleolithic artwork, which goes back maybe 50,000 years, maybe even more, is thought to have origins in altered states of consciousness. Maybe psychedelic, we're not entirely sure. Potentially some other kind of altered state of consciousness. I do happen to say, however, turns out whilst we were there, we found loads of liberty cap magic mushrooms growing in the field right next to it, which we observed growing and still managed to give us an interesting experience inside the burial tomb, but that's a whole other story. Nevertheless, sorry, we should talk about academics and mental health problems and drug use, I think. That's the next talk. So there is a theory in archaeology that posits that all Upper Paleolithic rock art, the very first human art, was inspired by some kind of altered state of consciousness, potentially the use of maybe magic mushrooms, which happen to be growing in the region or something like that. And they support this argument by saying that you get these geometric patterns in altered states of consciousness, especially on psychedelics, which map quite conveniently to the varieties of Upper Paleolithic and even Mesolithic rock art that we see of these geometric patterns. Now, so that applies for non-representational art at the very least. So it seems that psychedelics potentially, or other altered states, might have been there at the very origins of human culture and art itself. Still somewhat speculative. Perhaps an even more speculative idea comes from the famous psychedelic raconteur and bard Terence McKenna. I don't know if anyone's heard of Terence yet. So he put forward this idea about 30 years ago, which has been dubbed the stoned ape hypothesis. And that is, he took this idea a little bit further and said, well, not only, Upper Paleolithic rock art, but something happened in the evolution of primates sometime in the last million years, maybe 200,000 years ago or so, that gave rise to the development of these kind of higher cognitive functions and the development and use of tools and language, for instance. And he said, well, our ancient ancestors were looking for foodstuffs, experimenting with various stuff, and maybe picked up some magic mushrooms on the savannas of Africa and gobbled them down. And sure enough, that led to some interesting experiences, possibly of the variety of synaesthesia, and that is a blending of the senses, so that, imagine our Paleolithic, probably older ancestor, let's call him Thrug, he picks up some magic mushrooms, he eats them, and suddenly he starts seeing sounds coming out of his mouth, a kind of classic experience of synaesthesia, for some types of synaesthesia anyway. And therefore, he was able to see the sounds coming out, starts making these vocalizations, ugh, 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 and then ugh maybe looked like a rock, and from that point on, rocks get called ugh, quite simple theory, really. So McKenna suggests that psychedelics also induce this kind of type of synaesthesia, and then they may have been kind of selected for the use of psychedelics because they gave us advantages in perhaps breeding, maybe making you hypersexual. We don't have much evidence on that, at least I don't anyway, and also potentially in inducing this kind of synesthetic experience, which gave rise to common nouns and the development of language. So I've taken a particular interest in that idea, not least because I happen to look like our ancient ancestors, though similarity is completely coincidental. But we did one of the first kind of serious studies looking at drug-induced experiences of synesthesia, and we found that actually, yes, the classic psychedelic like magic mushrooms and ayahuasca and DMT reliably induced experiences of synesthesia in people who didn't have it. And when we asked them what kinds of synesthesia it tended to induce, by far and away the most common variety was seeing sounds. And you know, you can think historically there's been many artists who probably were synesthetic and artists contemporaneously who certainly are synesthetic, and how that has had an influence on their work and creativity, Kandinsky and various other people, for instance. Nevertheless, like dipping into the neuroscience a little bit, what we think potentially gives rise to these kind of experiences of synesthesia is something that happens in the brain under the influence of psychedelics called hyperconnectivity. So here is the very first kind of brain imaging study at Imperial College about a decade ago, and they looked at people under placebo or under the influence of psilocybin from magic mushrooms. And you can see here, under the influence, these are schematics of the brain. The different colours represent different parts of the brain, the different circles, different regions kind of thing, little hubs. And then the lines in between represent the amount of communication going on between those different parts of the brain. So normally, your brain not on drugs, actually my brain not on drugs, because I was one of the participants in this study, interestingly. The one on the left, you'll see there is very specific and constrained and communication going on between very particular parts of the brain and not other regions, right? So that's what our brain is like ordinarily, or my brain at least. And then you add some psilocybin, you lift the lid and you pour in some magic mushrooms, and, you know, it turns into a bit of a party, really. As you can see, pretty much every part of the brain is simultaneously communicating with every other part of the brain. And we think that could be one of the ways in which we explain the idea of people having these experiences of synesthesia, the blending of the senses, where you may suddenly see shapes. No, wait a minute, we see shapes anyway, don't we? You may see sounds or taste shapes or something like that. And it also posited as one of the potential reasons for why we see this difference in how we approach creative tasks and problem-solving tasks. And so classically, what we normally have, and this is kind of relates to this kind of placebo condition when we're not on drugs, is ordinarily when we're given a task to solve, we tend to solve it, most of us anyway, in what we call convergent thinking. It's a normal, everyday, logical, linear kind of thinking where you take all the assembled facts related with the problem, and then you come up with the one best solution to that problem based on all the facts. Now, it turns out under the influence of psychedelics, that kind of convergent thinking reduces, and we have an increase in what we call divergent thinking. And that is, instead of just kind of putting all the facts together and coming up with one answer, it's very generative of new ideas, novel thoughts, kind of fresh associations of old memories and ideas, and mashing them together in very, very different ways and coming up with lots of potential solutions to an existing problem. Many of those ideas might be completely rubbish, it turns out. However, some of them have the potential to be kind of beneficial. And this kind of divergent thinking, certainly as it applies to scientific breakthroughs, is thought to be good for what we call the illumination phase of creative problem solving, and is also closely associated with creativity and creative ideas and creative ideation and thinking amongst artists as well. So as to the kind of origins of the research on this as it relates to artists and kind of creativity in the arts, there hasn't really been a lot done, it turns out. After, all right, there was a hiatus of research with psychedelics for about 50 years. And yet, in the era of the 1960s and since, in the last decade, when this research has been happening, there's been very, very little research directly exploring creativity with psychedelics in the arts. However, the 1960s was kind of a testament to that creativity in some respects, in that the 1960s was, the psychedelic 60s. And we know of the massive cultural footprint that occurred in fashion and music and language and art in various dimensions. So it's never been put to the scientific test or put under that microscope. In a kind of related domain area, however, is less well known of the effects of psychedelics on technology and science and innovation at that time in the 1960s, but it turns out there were various, at that time, the psychedelic epicenter in California in Haight-Ashbury happened to be just down the road from the home of the home computing industry as it was then, the startup companies, the nascent companies in which we're all so horribly dependent on these days. So people like Steve Jobs, I don't know if you've heard of him, made a few nasty products. He took LSD, of course he did, as did many of those startup personnel. And he said taking LSD was one of the 2 or 3 most important things he did in his life, right? Which is, okay, so we got to imagine you're Steve Jobs, so yeah, maybe Apple's probably the most important thing you did. Maybe LSD, maybe your family, not quite sure which, but, it's up there in that kind of like Holy Trinity at least somewhere. Other home computing execs in that era also took LSD, such as Bill Gates. You probably heard of him as well, although apparently he didn't take enough LSD, according to Steve Jobs, or his products would be more interesting. That's a true story. Nevertheless, there's a great book documenting this kind of undocumented countercultural history that the home computing industry was basically born of this kind of use of psychedelics, including the mouse itself, which is actually invented by somebody in a creative problem-solving study where they gave them either mescaline or LSD and got them to come up with some new products, patents, or publications. That was one of the last ever studies conducted in the 1960s before Prohibition. They took 27 people. They're all in kind of not in the creative arts, I have to say. They're all kind of tech, design, engineering, science professionals, and they had to come up with a new product or publication or patent, as I said. They give them LSD or mescaline, and the majority of them tended to come up with some breakthrough ideas, including a new mathematical theorem for NOR gate circuits, a new conceptual model of a photon. We obviously need more. A linear electron accelerator, beam steering. I don't even know what the hell that is, but it sounds great, and I want one for Christmas probably. Nevertheless, LSD in creative problem solving became a bit of an idea, albeit only based on this one ever scientific study. And the outcome of that study was that of the 27 participants, about a quarter of them solved their problems. 10% had, half of them had like kind of partial solutions. Many of them had new avenues, and only 4 of them said they didn't come up with any solutions to their technical problems. Nevertheless, and the overall kind of of this is that they reported that psychedelics enhanced their fluency and flexibility for generating ideas, that gave them superior visualizing capability, what we call enhanced mental imagery, which is what we call like hyperphantasia, the opposite of aphantasia, the lack of visual mental imagery, heightened motivation, increased empathy, concentration, access to the subconscious and unconscious material, reduced inhibition and anxiety, and an improved association of dissimilar ideas and capacity to restructure problems in a wider context. So although these were kind of tech, engineering, design, science professionals, you could see how these dimensions of enhanced creativity or creative insight could also apply to people in the kind of visual arts or other areas of art as well. So that was the kind of all the research that had pretty much been done. There's been a handful of little studies done since. I was lucky enough to conduct a replication of this study in a hospital in North London a few years ago, where we took 40 top-level scientists from Imperial and Oxford and Cambridge, all with PhDs in like maths, physics, engineering, biology, geology, you name it. And we gave them LSD for the very first time, which was kind of fun. And how I spent my weekends for about 6 months babysitting top-level scientists on their first acid trip. And I didn't even get to have any, which was quite annoying. But nevertheless, it was very entertaining. And, we very genuinely saw like this increase in this divergent thinking. People going in there with one problem and thinking they might get one solution and coming out with loads and loads of new ideas, even about problems they hadn't even been thinking about. And we also saw this reduction of convergent thinking in not one of our scientists could put their shoes on or tie their laces effectively, it turns out, let alone operate their laptops. They're all kind of going, oh, I'm having a good idea. I'm just going to open some files and check my data. And they're kind of like, ooh, they couldn't even turn their laptops on. So we know it reduces divergent thinking and seemingly enhances this kind of divergent thinking, reduces convergent thinking. To give you an example, one of the guys who was working in material science, he was trying to develop this, his brief was, which he'd been working on for about 3 years, trying to invent intelligent fabric, right? Probably for military purposes. He said it wasn't, but never mind. And in that, you make a kind of 2D laminar fabric that can be programmed into any 3D structure or shape. He'd been working on this for a long time. He'd been using this chainmail idea. It wasn't really working. He'd all but abandoned it, and then he came to our lab. He took LSD, and within about half an hour of coming up, he had one of these kind of eureka moments. Luckily, he didn't do what Archimedes did and ran naked through the streets shouting eureka. That would have got our study shut down, almost certainly. But he did kind of very quickly kind of sketch down what he was seeing in his mental imagery very vividly. And he then kind of computer designed it, 3D printed it, patented it, and it's now being developed by MIT and NASA. In that he found that it's got these interlocking triangles or pyramids held together with these rings, which can be programmed to expand or contract, and thereby give you this kind of any 3D laminar shape. So for him, it was a kind of quite an immediate breakthrough. Luckily, he de-embargoed himself because we haven't published this study yet, still after years. But I will give you one other example, and I think this is particularly interesting in that it evokes a particular kind of creative problem solving, which I think has some really beautiful applications. And it's what I call perspectivism. One of the participants was a biologist. He was working for 3 years at Cambridge University on his PhD in biology, working in the Panama jungle, taking samples, and he was looking at the relationship between this one type of plant and a type of fungus. And this kind of plant is very unique. It has, unlike all other types of plants, it has no chlorophyll. It doesn't photosynthesize. It doesn't get its energy from the sun. And in fact, it seemingly gets all of its energy out of the mycorrhizal fungi that it's growing directly out of. And it was always considered to be a parasitic relationship of the plant on the fungus, right? He wasn't sure, he'd been studying it for 3 years, still didn't know, came to our lab, we gave him LSD, told him to think about his problem, and then I had the pleasure of interviewing all the scientists afterwards. So I said to him, so Merlin, that was his name, how was your experience? And he said, well, I turned into the fungus. And I'm like, that's pretty cool. We're sure he didn't because we were watching him, right? But he nevertheless had the experience of turning into the fungus. And so we're like, hoping maybe he's had a kind of breakthrough, we said to him, and what was that like? And he said, slimy. And we're like, well, that was a waste of really good acid. He hasn't had any breakthroughs, what a disaster. Nevertheless, luckily for us, he published this book a few years afterwards. Really amazing book, top of the bestseller list for over a year, Entangled Life, everything you ever wanted to know about fungus. And it talks about him taking part in this experiment and how he said when he turned into the fungus, he was able to grow inside the rootstock of the plant and see it all from a very different perspective. In that, it changed his perspective, not also just about his problem, but about how we can do biology and how we can do science more generally, in that for the very first time, he wasn't thinking about his problem as Merlin Sheldrake, the human, the biologist. He was seeing it from the perspective of the fungus. And that gave him a whole set of different ideas about the nature of this relationship, which you can hopefully go away and test in the usual scientific manner. So science is good. In some ways, it's good at testing ideas, right? Science, it's kind of deduction, induction, hypothesis testing. It seems it's pretty bad, though, at generating ideas. The scientific method is not good at generating ideas, what we call the illumination phase of creative problem solving. That illumination phase also applies the same to artistic creativity and problems as well. But for Merlin, this experience of turning into the fungus changed his perspective. And it turns out that kind of shift in perspective change is how indigenous peoples who make use of psychedelics, probably since the Paleolithic era, obtain knowledge of the world. It's like if you want to understand what the medicinal properties of a particular plant are, and you happen to live in the Amazon jungle, then you might well drink ayahuasca and then turn into that plant and therefore understand its medicinal properties. It's like the complete opposite end of the spectrum of objective science. Objective science is you take a thing, you drag it out of its normal environment, you atomize it, you desiccate it, you chop it up, you stick it under a microscope, you try and get as far away from it as possible, and then hope that you can understand something about it, right? Whereas indigenous perspectivism is the complete opposite. You try and get as close to that thing as possible. It's a knowing by becoming. And that's just one of the kind of potential beautiful dimensions of this kind of psychedelic experience that can give fresh insights on kind of creativity. So I'm going to round it up by saying, I think psychedelics can be useful for generating synaesthesia. They're also good for enhancing cognitive flexibility, it turns out. Also useful for enhancing mental imagery, divergent thinking, and also a particular kind of mental imagery which we call perspectivism, and that's seeing things from the perspective of something else, right? Now, I'm not suggesting everybody rushes out and gobbles down loads of psychedelics to enhance their creative output or their artwork. There are other techniques which are probably cheaper, safer, and more legal, like just do some breath work or get into your dreams. Various creatives and scientists over the years have done various techniques like kind of being in a kind of meditative state and holding onto a ball, and then when you kind of so you drop into a state of hypnagogia, but you don't actually fully fall asleep. When you drop the ball out of your hand, it bounces on the floor and wakes you up. So just kind of surfing these hypnagogic states, these dreamlike states between waking and sleeping have also been found to be very similar to psychedelic states, and also very good for generating kind of fresh ideas and this enhanced divergent thinking. Anyway, I think I've tried to hit my 12 minutes. Here's my book. Loads of good reviews on Amazon, mostly written by me. And this is the thank you slide. Thank you.